Hello and welcome to Mandibil. This is part 15 of my deconstruction of Stefan Molyneux' book, Essential Philosophy. And last time we dealt with the chapter called Materialism and Determinism. And I wasn't really that enlightened on where he was trying to go with that. So I'll leave it up to you to go through that. I'll step right into the next chapter called Free Will, an introduction, and I see that penultimate chapter sort of an introduction to an introduction of free will. So let's see what it says in Free Will. If I stop a man and ask him for directions and he tells me to go east and west at the same time, I do not need to compare his directions to a map in order to know that he's wrong. Again, there's these contradiction statements. He seems to have some kind of fetish for creating contradictions and then sort of in an attempt to use that as some kind of indirect argument or sort of giving you an approach into an argument that he doesn't really present, right? As I mentioned in earlier parts, it seems like he's walking around his own philosophy and saying it's incorrect out here, incorrect there, incorrect there, incorrect there, right? Instead of saying I'm right because all these things are wrong, then take in whatever he thinks is right and present that, right? There's a problem, in my opinion, in if you're presenting a manual for something, some object, let's say, right? This is an analogy, right? If you're making a manual for a kitchen aid of something, right? You don't have to state all the ways you do it wrongly, right? You tell people how to do it right. You don't write a manual that says don't do this, don't do that, don't do that, and don't do this and don't do that, right? And then you'll be fine. No, you put it this way. Do this, point 1, do this, point 2, do that, point 3, do this, and then do that. And then you should be fine, right? That's the right approach, in my opinion, right? And I'm not sure why he does it this way, because it's like he's sort of distancing himself a bit from his own philosophy and talking about how everybody else does it wrongly, right? Okay. If a man sends me an email containing the argument that emails never get delivered, I do not need to know anything about how emails are delivered in order to reject his hypotheses. Again, there's a contradictory statement, right? If a woman tells me she does not think I exist, I do not need to know any metaphysical proof for my own existence in order to reject her hypotheses. Since she addresses her words to me, she cannot rationally claim that I do not exist. Well, I don't see that it's this implicit self-detonating argument, right? If I say, well, you won't understand. So I say that streaming software doesn't exist, and here I am using a streaming software to present to you the argument that streaming software doesn't exist. So if I say there's nothing wrong in the statement as such, internally wrong in the statement, streaming software doesn't exist, but since I'm using streaming software to get to you, well, you have to sort of trust me on that, right? Then it's self-contradictory. It's in between the lines. It's within the action I'm using to present the argument contradicts the argument, right? So I understand that. But let's take this one for a dive, right? If a woman tells me she does not think I exist, I do not need to know any metaphysical proofs for my own existence in order to reject her hypotheses. Since she addresses her words to me, she cannot No. But then you are, as a receiver of the argument, you are taking your experience of that sound. You might just remember, or I'm looking for a word again. My vocabulary has apparently stepped a few notches down this afternoon. It's good to remind yourself that what you call language is basically just sounds, right? That's the empirical data you are receiving. It may be vision as letters, but let's just say we are talking about sounds, right? So an argument is a sound. So that sound you are receiving doesn't have the language. You are the one using that language to interpret that sound as a language that has a specific meaning, right? So if you're saying that information is delivered from the outside, which you just said earlier in this text, well, basically your outside is then, according to yourself, presenting that argument to you, but you are nowhere nearer in that case that is actually an object outside yourself. If you are basically your own experience, it's your interpretation of your experience which you then claim is an existence outside yourself, claiming that you don't exist, right? So this is a bit more complicated that he is presenting here, but I understand the analogy for where he's going with self-refuting arguments, right? Okay, so let's head on. In other words, we first examine the rational consistency of the argument before comparing it to empirical evidence. A self-contradictory argument can be dismissed without the requirement to appeal to contradictory empirical evidence. Well, yeah, I guess. If I tell you that you cannot trust the evidence of your senses and that language is meaningless, language is meaning, right? So language is meaningless is in itself a contradiction. Language is meaning. It's an understanding of the meaning of sounds, or maybe text, but let's just stay with sound, right? Senses doesn't give you evidence. You could say that evidence is something that could potentially lead you to a knowledge, right? If I want to go to Paris, there's some evidence along the way that I would say, well, now I'm getting closer to Paris. That is evidence towards Paris, right? But my senses doesn't deliver the evidence. The evidence is circumstantial according to the purpose of my endeavor, right? Evidence is also a interpretation of your experience, right? So again, it's these terms that are sort of fluffy, right? If I tell you that you cannot trust the evidence of your senses and that language is meaningless, these can be positions consistent within themselves, but they are not consistent with my actions. If I say you cannot trust the evidence of your senses, but I rely upon the trustworthiness of your evidence of your senses in order to communicate my argument, then my argument contradicts its own hypothesis. If I use language to convey to you the idea that language is meaningless, then my methodology contradicts my hypothesis. If language is meaningless, then I cannot use it to convey any idea to you, let alone an idea about language. If language is not meaningless, then I can use it to convey an argument to you. I just can't use it to convey that language is meaningless, because then my hypothesis contradicts my methodology. Testing the hypothesis of an argument against the methodology of communicating the argument is a powerful method for rejecting irrational arguments. You cannot argue that the senses are invalid, since you must use the senses to communicate. The ears for hearing the argument, the eyes for seeing it, and so on. You cannot use logical arguments to disprove the value of logic. You cannot use he's just piling piling on top of, if you do this, it's wrong. If this, you do this, you do this, and you do this, and you do this. It might not be bad arguments or bad statements, but it's just you're getting bombarded with arguments in a just a stream of consciousness, right? And it's like, as a reader, you are being bitch slapped, as I used the term before in other deconstructions, right? It's just an annoying way of being handled arguments from the writer, right? It's like you can't handle so many arguments in one sense, in one go, and get to grips with what he's talking about in a larger context, right? And that's kind of annoying. You want to ease it a bit, right? It's essential philosophy. It's not, carpet bombing philosophy. So, before embarking on the task of repudiating a particular hypothesis, it is essential to examine the arguments embedded in the hypothesis. Sophists in particular always want to drag you into disproving a hypothesis when 9 times out of 10 the disproof is embedded in the methodology on the way they communicate the argument. Embedded in every attempt to use the senses to compute reason and evidence to prove an argument are a number of unshakable assumptions. Reason is infinitely preferable to unreason. I don't like that, right? What is preferability? He hasn't clarified that, right? What is unreason compared to reason? What is infinitely? Is that infinity is not something I like very much to use in philosophy as far as I can avoid it, right? At least not in an argument. Okay. 2. Empirical evidence is infinitely preferable to conceptual hypotheses. So, mass or atoms and energy are conceptual hypotheses, right? They're not empirical evidence. You don't experience, oxygen atoms or, nitrogen atoms or molecule, right? When you're walking around here, right? So your own arguments are infinitely less preferable according to your own statement here, right? Truth is infinitely preferable to error, but truth is not contradicted by error or the complementary thing to truth is false, right? Truth is not opposite to error. You're mixing the terms here, mate, right? This infinitely preferable? No. He's sneaking in this term preferable because he needed later to become his version of ethics, right? So this preferable is sort of, you're being groomed into understanding preferable as an important term that isn't clarified, right? At least not yet. Truth is not opposite to error, right? Error is incorrect according to a methodology where a description of what is correct, right? If you're in error, then you're not doing it according to the method. But true is when I experience elephant. If I don't experience elephant, I'm not in error, right? But I'm not experiencing any elephant right now. Am I in if somebody made the proposition that's an elephant, I would have to say that it's false, in my opinion. But he apparently thinks I'm supposed to say that's an error. But no. So I'm in error, or the proposition is an error, or what? It's very bad philosophy, this, right? 4. Truth requires rational consistency and empirical evidence. No, truth doesn't require anything but an experience and a proposition that matches that experience, right? Or an experience that matches a proposition. If I experience elephant and somebody says that's an elephant, well, then I have truth because I experienced that elephant that is proposed. So it's true compared to the proposition. So it doesn't require consistency, or it requires empirical evidence, if that's how you want to put it. And the empiricism is my experience of that particular objectification or conceptualization called elephant, right? So 5, the person communicating the argument and the person receiving it both exist independent of each other within an objective and empirical. But that's a claim. That's traditionally a very big and constantly argued part of metaphysics, whether or not what it means to exist, right? You can't just say it exists, right? We both exist. Well, it's just okay. Is it an axiom that whoever claims that something exists, that must make it existing, that creates that existence? That's not enough to justify existence, because it has to be anchored in your reduction base, and it has to be some kind of experience then, in my opinion, right? So if he has a reduction base called matter and energy, well, then how do I get to existence from matter and energy? Because I'm not experiencing matter. I'm not experiencing energy. I'm experiencing colors and sounds and so on. And then I have my conceptualizations like cup of tea, elephant, and so on, right? 6, the senses are valid enough to accurately transmit and receive an argument. Valid enough? There's also just a claim. It's just who he says, well, it's valid. So go out into the world. I've told you it's valid. But it's like, yeah, maybe he delved into it before, but I didn't take those arguments very seriously, because it didn't sound like very good arguments as far as I can remember, right? So it's like he's not even connecting the dots. He is sort of saying, here are the dots, right? And they're connected because I present them, right? It's like it's just very loose, if non-existing, valid arguments for validity, right? 7, language is meaningful enough to accurately transmit and receive an argument. So the senses are valid enough to accurately transmit and receive an argument. Language is meaningful enough to accurately transmit and receive an argument. So he's basically saying that language and senses are valid in the same way that language is meaningful. Right? The senses are valid enough to accurately transmit and receive an argument. Language is meaningful enough to accurately transmit and receive an argument. So it's like he is equating senses and language by saying they are meaningful enough in exactly the same way. I'm not saying it's necessarily incorrect, but it just smells bad in my opinion, right? Okay. 8, the person communicating the argument assumes that those receiving the argument have the capacity to change their minds based on reason and evidence. Why? Why are they assuming that by communicating? You're saying they wouldn't communicate, but maybe they don't want necessarily to change your mind. They want to agree upon something in your mind, right? They want to reach objectivity. If I say that's an elephant, it doesn't mean necessarily I want to change your mind about elephant. I actually might want to agree upon the elephant, right? Capacity to change that. He's very concerned about changing minds, apparently, right? That's sort of important. So it's a kind of Freudian slip into what he is attempting to do with his philosophy is changing other people's minds, right? Okay, 9, rational argument is superior to physical force. Where did that come from? Physical force? He hasn't talked about physical force yet. Superior? What is superior? Is better argued, higher philosophical level? What is is it more true, or what the hell is superior? Rational argument is superior to physical force. Well, if somebody comes towards my children with a chainsaw, I'm not going to argue, am I? I'm using physical force. So it's not always superior to physical force. And then he's going to say, aha, fluffy boundaries, right? Fluffy boundaries. No. If you're saying rational argument is superior to physical force, you're saying that every time you make an argument, it is superior to physical force no matter what. That's implicit in what you're saying. You're very concerned about when things are set implicit within a text, right? And now you are implicitly saying it's completely superior all the time. An argument is superior to physical force, right? Well, I'm just considered a situation where I would consider a rational argument lesser to physical force. Don't understand superior, but let's just say to refute it, I'm saying lesser than physical force. Or the rational argument is lesser than physical force, right? Physical force is superior to rational argument. So it doesn't hold, right? It's like, I don't buy this, right? I don't buy these 9 sort of seemingly quite arbitrarily chosen, but following a certain underlying agenda points, right? Okay, this list goes on for a long time, but you get the general idea. It goes on for a long time? So if you speak very slowly, you can make it take a year to list it. And if you speak slowly, maybe 2 months, or what are we dealing with, right? The list goes on for a long time? It's just a weird way of framing it or arguing. And how do you know I get the general idea? I'm not sure I get the general idea here, right? The very act of engaging in a debate reveals a packaged list of accepted assumptions and axioms that really need to be examined before everyone goes around chasing the conclusion and debating the surface arguments. One of the main problems people have with debates is that implicit assumptions are not made explicit but become horrifyingly clear over the course of a disastrous conversation. If a man wants to debate you and he openly states that he considers truth equivalent to error, but who does that? And you can't, it's again the same comparison of truth to error. No, you got the whole thing in the wrong throat here, right? You're sort of choking on this understanding of metaphysics and epistemology. It doesn't work. Truth and error are not comparable. And that's not what he says, but he said that earlier. But in this case, he is saying truth equivalent to error. Well, if somebody told me, or I agreed with another guy that he should deliver an elephant to me today at this point in time, right? And what I see is a goat, right? Then I would say that goat is not an elephant, right? That's an error according to our agreement. But it's true that it's a goat, right? And it would be false that it's an elephant. The truth is an error in the sense that the goat, which is the truth for me, is an error compared to the agreement I had with that guy who's supposed to deliver me an elephant, right? So these real life situation just doesn't match up with the way you're describing your philosophy. And your philosophy should be an sort of an umbrella description of reality and how you deal with reality, right? So it has to fit. It doesn't fit, in my opinion, right? Reason equivalent to screaming that he will never ever change his mind, and if you refuse to submit to his, I don't know what kind of people he surrounds himself with, who are constantly contradicting themselves or claiming that, truth is error. I don't know what kind of people is he surrounding himself with, right? I never meet people like that, right? Never. So often people pretend to debate when they are really seeking to dominate, justify themselves, or frustrate others. Oh, okay. he has very, very bad, experiences with debating, apparently, right? Causality and determination. Determinism, sorry. The determinist position states that the human mind is not magically exempt from the general. It's kind of weird, just remember it, right? He was talking about free will and introduction. There's nothing here that seems to be free will. Free will is, and we are not even talked about free will yet, but all these very weird kinds of arguments. It's just strange, right? Okay. The determinist position states that the human mind is not magically exempt from the general laws of causality in the universe. If determinists really accept this position, then clearly they should not treat the human mind as any different from any other object in the universe. But objects and universe is also a part of your mind, right? That's your mind's conceptualization of your experience, right? It's like you're talking, always remember you're talking about your experience whenever you refer to empirical sense data or qualia or objectifications / conceptualizations of that experience, right? That's all you have, right? You have your experience inside your mind. That's all you have to go with. Don't pretend that your experience is somehow describing that it somehow is that apparently magical objective reality outside your mind, right? And this sifts through in all kinds of arguments here. So it's most of the arguments henceforth will possibly be infected by this misconception of metaphysics. And as I pointed out earlier, metaphysics and the the reduction base is so freaking important, right? Because if you start from in the wrong direction when you are heading out into the world or into philosophy, you're bound to get everything wrong, right? If you owe me $10 and I say I don't care which $10 bill you give me, then I have no rational right to object to any one $10 bill. If you ask me, all these examples, get to the freaking point, man, right? Isn't it about free will? I mean, okay, maybe it's implicit, but it's just, If you ask me whether I would prefer pasta or fish for dinner, and I tell you I have no preferences whatsoever, does it make any sense for me to rage at you for serving me fish and throw the plate out the window? If I do such a thing, then I clearly was lying to you when I said I had no preference. That was in the past. Maybe that preference occurred between the time you said it and when you received the pasta or the fish. And and if the fish smells like shit, maybe you are raging for serving fish. I don't know, but it's just a stupid example, right? It's stupid. To go even further, and trust me, even this isn't going far enough. If your wife tells you she doesn't care whether you both go to Florida and California for vacation, and you choose Florida, and she tells you the only a truly insane person will ever, and she thinks that you're mentally ill for even suggesting. What are these examples? They're like the trolley problem or something. It's sort of situations that never occur, right? Yeah, I understand the point that if you're self-contradictory in your statements, there's something wrong. But do you need to make 10 examples of that, right? You would think that she was crazy, right? To say that she has no preference and then to scream that you are insane for choosing one thing or the other only reveals her own instability. Okay, let's say that. Hypocrisy and dangerously manipulative nature. The determinist position is that the human brain is exactly like everything else in the universe. Okay, well, this is an artifact of bad metaphysics. That's materialist metaphysics, right? This is where the mental experience or the experience of that potential outside, let's say, an experience of it, not the outside itself, is sort of different from the outside, right? The materialist makes the fallacy of that reality that they have as a sort of a stored up induction and memories and all that understanding is actually the thing outside, right? But that is still inside, and you have your live experience only to know what is going on and create that larger picture of that reality in a sort of an abstraction of your perpetual experience, right? And saying that that larger abstractly constructed experience of reality is the actual thing outside which you are experiencing is so fucking, obnoxious that it's actually incredible that the most people in the world do not understand this paradox they are living from. I'm not saying that you shouldn't trust your experiences, far from it. Actually, the idealist position that I'm working from, at least, right, is actually saying your experience is all you've got. Care for it and make sure that you make the best possible use of it, right? It's all you've got, your experience, right? Everything else is some kind of derivative of your experience. The brain contains no special magical capacity for free will, and believing it does. Did I get all this? Yeah, I think. Does is akin to believing that the last domino in a stacked line chooses to fall over when it is bumped by the previous falling domino. Very well, let us take determinists at their word. The human brain is exactly the same as everything else in the universe. But this reeks of that fallacy I mentioned before, right? You have your experience and that's all. And it's actually, philosophy becomes so much simpler, right? When you have some insight that creates more parsimony, makes things simpler, and Occam's razor and all that, right? That's where you should go, in my opinion, right? Parsimony and simplicity and symmetry even, right? A symmetry. There's no symmetry in I have an experience, but I only have experience, yet I have access to this outside, which is better, or maybe my experience. So it's just, it doesn't work, right? It doesn't work, and there's also this hard problem of consciousness, right? Which and the problem of other minds also, right? That you run into when you have this materialist understanding of your experience, right? So it's just, it'll get nowhere, this, right? And therefore it should be treated no different from anything else. The human brain has no free will, just like a television, a blade of grass, a cloud, a clock, or a water tower. A sports fanatic may very well encourage his team by yelling at the television, but he does not believe that his team is able to hear him and change their behavior based on his ranting. A gambler may cheer for a lucky roll, but he does not think his cheering encourages the dice to do what he wants. People will vent an inanimate objects. People will vent at inanimate objects. A golfer may throw, but we recognize this as immaturity. When questioned, the angry golfer does not argue that his club has grown a brain and free will and works viciously to thwart his desire for a good swing. It is an irrational eccentricity to treat inanimate objects as if they have a human brain. When people do, we do not believe that tantrums are philosophically sound, and neither do they, we hope, after they calm down. If a man stabs a woman, we do not blame the knife for dragging the poor man's hand towards her flesh. We do not blame his hand, we do not blame his arm, we blame his consciousness, if we blame anything at all. This is then the central question for those who hold the determinist position. If human consciousness is exactly the same as everything else in the universe, then why do you treat human consciousness so differently? That's a good point, right? And at least it points in the right direction, in my opinion, right? Because at least those who claim determinism or reject free will they seem to have a will of their own anyway, right? If you call them on the phone or write them an email, they answer the email, they arrive at your door if you ask them at a certain point in time and so on. It's just weird that my email can somehow be in complete concordance with that action in the future that I sort of begged for in my email or in my phone call to that particular person object, right? So if I call a determinist and say, well, would you come to me tomorrow? Yeah, sure, I'll come to you tomorrow at 6 o'clock. And there he is, 6 o'clock. How the hell can my voice be in concordance with that in the future unless that object can control whatever happens at that point in the future, right? Can imagine the future and all that. It doesn't prove anything. There's no empirical way of proving free will, but everything points in that direction, right? If it's the same argument, you can't get to it closer than that. Maybe there's a few other arguments I won't present here that I might use in my book, but it's like some guy who has his whole apartment full of knives and attack dogs and hand grenades and saying no, I'm peaceful as as a lamb, right? And there's the shotguns and there are pistols and knives and attack dogs and everything under the sun, right? And you're saying, I am not going to trust what happens in the world and not as an indicator of what is really going on in people's minds, rather than trusting what they say. Because that's still my interpretation of what they say. So they're just using my interpretation of that. And I'd also say that there might be a use for something like Pascal's wager, or sort of, what is the worst case here, right? Isn't the worst case that you could say that maybe let me see, I hadn't really thought this through, but let me try. There can be free will and there cannot be free will. There can be people who believe in free will and people who do not believe in free will, right? Well, if people have free will, it doesn't matter whether or not they believe in it. And if they don't have free will, it doesn't matter whether they believe it anyway, right? So if people don't have free will, it's actually, no, if people have free will, but I can't find it out, it's actually worse than if they don't have free will and I can't figure it out, right? So if I can't figure it out, I have to go with the worst case, which is they have a free will. So if they have a free will, but can convince me that they don't have free will, that's even worse. Because then I might be believing that they don't have free will, and whatever happens to me by their accord is just, well, I don't have free will, right? Don't blame me, I don't have free will. So it's like, and I would also like to see in some, bigger discussion online or TV or something, that somebody who doesn't believe in free will and some who does believe in free will, where the guy who does believe in free will slaps the one who doesn't have free will on the face, in one big fucking slap on the face, and say, I'm sorry, that's just what happens when you don't have free will, right? And if he says, what the hell, slap him another time, to say, don't blame me, I don't have free will, right? It's like, and then you will also possibly try to avoid the hitting and so on, which would be an indication of free will, right? So it's just this, in the situation when everything seems to be pointing in the direction of free will, it's likely, in my opinion, you should treat it as if people have free will, right? And when you get down to these dualist, materialist arguments are sort of invalid because it is based on wrong metaphysics, right? So you have to have the right metaphysics and work from there to get an idea of how you handle this idea of free will, right? Okay. This is really how far did I get? In the Shakespeare's drama, King Lear, the mad king rages as a storm. This is considered a sign of insanity. But why? The weather is a highly complex system whose behavior can only be predicted in the short term and in general. Even determinists admit that a group of human beings is a highly complex system and human behavior can only be predicted in the short term and in general, as in the basic economic premise that human beings respond to incentives. Raging at a man who has done you great evil is not insane. Raging at a storm clearly is, but for a determinist, what is the difference? The man has no more free will than the storm, so raging at the man is exactly the same as raging at the storm. I get that. I understand that. Because if determinists are telling people that there's no free will, why are they not talking to a tree, right? Why are they not talking to a cloud or to a cow, right? They're always talking to other people, those they claim that do not have free will. But to one who doesn't believe in free will, everything should be equal, right? Everything doesn't have free will. So why then arguing with the clouds and all that and saying that you, Mr. Cloud, you do not have free will, right? It's like there's so much as also Stefan Molyneux pointed out, that you need to pretend isn't there in order for make some kind of coherent argument against determinism, right? It's just because that you can't get to an experience of the free will, maybe not even in yourself, right? But that's a deeper question that needs a bit of philosophy, in my opinion, and it's possibly something that you have to state axiomatically, and that's it. We go from that axiom. If you don't like the axiom, well, we can't work together. So that kind of thing, right? So that might be where we end up after all with free will. If you're injured by the side of the road, you may choose to flag down a passing motorist in the hope of getting help. If a tumbleweed is... if you park a car, so run you up to say a man pushing, boulder down the hill. Suppose that a hard rain is loosened the foundation, keeping the boulder in place, causing it to roll down the hill across your car. These are mere acts of physical determinism. No choices are involved. No free will is involved. It is just matter and objects obeying inevitable physical laws. If however, it turns out that the man purposely dislodged the boulder that ended up rolling down the hill and crossing your car, is it really that hard to understand that we have an entirely different situation? If it turns out that a man who dislodged the boulder has a grudge, but how can it turn out that he has a grudge, right? How do you experience that grudge? You can't experience a grudge, right? This is a fallacy that you can experience. Well, then you have to make some superficial second-hand judgment of his appearances and his anger or whatever. But that's not the grudge. That's what you consider an evidence towards a grudge, right? But we are talking about knowing here, right? We are not talking about potential evidence that points in a certain direction, right? Which might be influenced by your prejudice. Pushed it on purpose to cross your car, perhaps with the hope that you were inside it. Then it is not even an accidental occurrence. When I was a little boy, I liked throwing rocks. Once when I was walking with my mother by the side of the road, I threw a rock in the air and it ended up landing on the expensive hood of some man's sports car, leaving a wide spider web of divots. I was very young, so the man mostly got angry at my mother for letting me engage in such risky behavior. The first situation is where the rock dislodges on its own, in which case the crushing of your car is no one's fault, except possibly yours for parking in a place. In the second case, a man dislodges a rock for fun, crushing your car by accident. He acts carelessly and dangerously and therefore is responsible for the car being crushed, but not responsible for willfully crushing your car. No, but these, you don't have access to what people's incentives are. You can't experience the incentives. So this is dangerous territory, right? A reasonable, just solution would be to have him pay for repairs, but not to put him in jail for trying to cause you harm. In the third case, the man dislodges a rock with the intention of crossing your car. He is then responsible for willfully damage. All these examples, man, I'm getting tired of it. If the man's actions were careless, if the man's actions were malevolent, but you don't know that, right? They can be malevolent and everything points in the direction he didn't do it on purpose or malevolently, but yet he was malevolent. And the other way around, right? We have accident, carelessness, or malevolence. If you are determinist, these different situations are exactly the same because there is no difference between a boulder and a human being. The boulder has no free will and the human being has no free will either. If one boulder crashed into another boulder and the second boulder crashed into my car, we would not hold the first boulder responsible because it was just obeying the blind laws of physics. Why would it be any different if you are a determinist with a man? A man is just a boulder, no difference at all. If from the bottom of the hill you look up and see a man pushing a boulder that could fall on your car, you would surely call out for him to stop. If he has already dislodged the boulder, do you think you would call out for the boulder itself to stop in its tracks? Of course not. So I understand these arguments, and they're fairly decent arguments that points in the direction of people having free will. I would say the way to go with the idea of free will is state axiomatically, make some good, what would that be called? Arguments that points in a direction that it makes sense to believe in free will. And then state axiomatically, I am working from the idea of free will, right? And if you don't like that axiom, well, we disagree, we agree to disagree. You go that way, I go this way, right? If from the bottom you look, if you are a parent and you see another example, I'm fucking tired of it. Yeah. But I think that determinists, they either don't like to have the idea of free will, or they like for some other agenda, like Christians like the idea of free will, and if you are atheist, if you can say there's no free will, then you can demolish Christianity or something like that. There's always, I believe personally, some agenda for not believing in free will, because everything, in my opinion, points towards free will, right? Even if I can't prove it, there it is, look at it, right? Saying a robot is like a human being is ridiculous. I'm going to jump a little. I'm tired of these examples. If determinists want to compare humans to robots, they subsequently create a logical avenue proving the existence of God. Once God's existence is established, this disproves determinism because the choice can be made. I have to get that back to this. Once God's existence is established, or at least allowed, then determinism becomes falsified because you have a consciousness in the form of a God that is not bound by any known physical laws or properties. Once you allow for the existence of consciousness without a material basis, then you open up the possibility of the soul. This disproves determinism because the choice can be made immaterially, unbound by any material constraints. In this scenario, if every material action is triggered by a prior material action, the only chance to escape this inevitable causality must be for an immaterial cause to intervene. If reality unfolds like dominoes falling against each other, then the only chance for choice must be something that is not a domino, not material such as the soul. If God exists, then my immaterial consciousness exists. Since determinism is bound only by the material, immaterial consciousness escapes the inevitabilities of determinism. So it's a very long-winded way of trying to be proponent of free will, right? I understand where it's going. It's just it's like I'll just add 15 examples and then it's 15 times better and more certain about free will if I just made one example. So it's like I'm talking about God, or so. I don't like that, right? No, determinism cannot be proved with reference to anything other than human consciousness. If free will is valid, then a man can choose to create a robot. The deterministic nature of the robot tells you nothing about the choices of the man. I can choose to throw a rock off a cliff. The fact that the rock's path is then determined tells you nothing about whether my brain is determined. Referencing the effects of free will to disprove free will is like using a statue's shadow to disprove a shadow. I understand where it's going. I don't think this is sort of what's circumstantial evidence or something like that. Evidence of free will is not a proof of free will. I think it should stay with, okay, all the evidence points in the directions of free will, but I can never prove free will. But in my opinion, if you can't prove free will, you can't prove determinism either. It doesn't follow necessarily that there must be something must be determined. And furthermore, I don't like the term determined, because what is that? Who's determining, right? That seems like some kind of will, right? So it's like, okay, if you go back to the start of the universe and, everything started there, well, what was before that and all that? So all these discussions, right? I don't like that. I have a will. If I say to you, I'm going to grab that cup of tea, right? And then I'm going to do it now, right? This is tea. You have to believe me, I guess. Take a sip of. How can I predict that? How am I able to predict what is going to happen in the future, right? Without free will, it just doesn't happen, right? Why would I have the ability to predict it if I couldn't act accordingly, right? It doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't make any normal everyday sense to approach it as determinism, right? And then I would, the first determinist that I see, I would just slap him on the face and kick him in the balls and so on, right? Or grab her tits if that's it and say, well, determinism, right? Yeah, don't blame me. I'm determined to do it, right? But no. Then they say, no, you should behave. No, and then they just refute their determinism because they don't like whatever happens because of determinism, right? So it's like everything points in the direction of free will. So that's what I would go with, right? Okay. I guess it's kind of decently argued this on despite it being very sort of bloated in the way it's done, right? It could be made more simplistic. Arguments and uniqueness. Well, why don't we keep that one until next time, right? So I'll just highlight this one and say, see